I was the chief surgeon who separated conjoined twins at this hospital. But when I came to the ER with appendicitis, Nurse Brenda ripped off my hijab and made me walk laps to prove I wasn't faking. After my appendix ruptured and they found out who I was, I discovered Brenda had friends in eye-deleting security footage and HR destroying complaints. Now someone's been breaking into my apartment and slashing my tires with notes, warning me to stop investigating. After developing severe abdominal pain, I ended up in the ER of the exact hospital where I'd performed my infamous conjoined twin separation. I walked in doubled over, my hijab damp with sweat with vomit stains on my sleeves from the taxi ride. Nurse Brenda looked up from her computer and her fingers stopped typing mid-word. Her eyes traveled from my hijab to my face, to the way I clutched my right side. She pointed to the far corner of the waiting room without saying anything. Each step sent lightning bolts through my abdomen. 10 minutes later, an elderly white couple walked in and sat in the middle section. The nurse immediately called them forward for triage. I watched 3 more patients arrive after me and get seen first. Each time, the nurse's eyes would sweep past me like I was part of the furniture. The pain was getting sharper now, like someone was twisting a knife in my gut. When she finally looked in my direction, she didn't even glance at my paperwork. "The religious woman with the headscarf in the back," she called out dismissively. The entire waiting room turned to watch me struggle to stand. My legs shook, and I had to grip the armrest to pull myself up. She announced loudly enough for everyone to hear that they had special protocols for patients like me. During the assessment, she made me stand even though I could barely stay upright. The room started spinning and I had to lock my knees to keep from collapsing. The pain had me seeing spots, but she acted like I was being dramatic. "Your culture always exaggerates women's normal monthly pain," she said, while barely glancing at my vitals. My temperature was 102, but she wrote down 95. I could feel my appendix throbbing with each heartbeat. I tried explaining that I was having severe right lower quadrant pain with rebound tenderness, classic appendicitis symptoms. She cut me off and said I probably didn't even understand what appendicitis was. Then she announced to her colleague that my type had different pain tolerance anyway, so it was hard to assess accurately. When I asked to use the bathroom because I felt like I was going to vomit again, she said facilities were for processed patients only. I'd been there 2 hours already. My mouth tasted like metal and my stomach churned violently. She sent me back to the corner to wait. The walk back felt like miles, and I had to stop twice to breathe through the stabbing sensation. Another hour passed before she called me up again. This time, she demanded to see identification, and when I reached for my wallet, she suddenly grabbed my hijab and yanked it off my head. "Proper ID verification requires full facial visibility," she declared, while holding my hijab like it was contaminated. My hair tumbled down my shoulders, and I felt naked, more exposed than I'd ever been in public. She made me turn in a full circle while other patients watched. Some looked uncomfortable, but nobody said anything. The pain was getting worse. When I tried to explain this, she pressed brutally on my abdomen right where it hurt most. I screamed and doubled over. My knees hit the floor hard, but I barely felt it compared to the explosion in my gut. She wrote something on her chart and said I needed to walk laps around the waiting room to prove I wasn't faking for pain medication. I managed 3 steps before the room tilted sideways. My stomach convulsed and I vomited bile onto the floor. The movement sent such intense pain through my side that tears streamed down my face. She stepped back disgusted and called for janitorial. Then she said if I couldn't control myself, I'd have to wait outside. I begged for the bathroom just to clean myself up. She said no. I asked for anti-nausea medication. She said no. I told her I was a doctor, and I knew my appendix was about to rupture. Each word took enormous effort to get out. That's when she screamed that I was making terrorist threats by claiming to be a doctor. Security grabbed both my arms and started dragging me toward the exit. "Go back where you came from for treatment." She spat as they hauled me outside. They threw me onto the pavement just as my legs gave out completely. The impact sent such brutal pain through my abdomen that everything went black for a second. As I collapsed from pain, my old hospital ID tumbled from my bag. Chief of Pediatric Surgery, 2015 to 2020. The intake nurse picked it up and was about to toss it aside when she saw the name. Dr. Amamira Hassan. The pen dropped from her hand. "Oh my gosh, you're her." The security guard stepped back. "The conjoined twin surgeon?" Another nurse gasped. "The one who did the 18-hour separation?" I was writhing on the floor, appendix about to burst. "Get her to surgery now," someone yelled. 6 hours later, I woke up in recovery. The same nurse who tormented me stood in the doorway with the administrator. Her face had lost all color. The administrator asked if I wanted her terminated immediately. I looked at her for a long moment. "No," I said finally. Not because I wasn't upset. I was not because I wasn't humiliated. I absolutely was, but because at that moment I realized something crucial. Nurse Brenda had no idea what was coming. 2 days later, I walked back into the hospital through the main entrance. My surgical site still throbbed with each step, but I kept my posture straight. The security guard, who had thrown me out, recognized me immediately. His eyes widened, and he stepped aside without a word. I made my way to the administrative offices on the 4th floor. The hallway stretched endlessly before me. Each fluorescent light buzzed overhead like an accusation. Hospital staff passed by, some doing double takes when they recognized me. A few nodded respectfully, others quickly looked away. Word had spread fast about what happened in the ER. I reached the office of Dr. Theodore Blackwood, the chief medical officer. His secretary glanced up from her computer and immediately stood. She knew who I was. Everyone in this hospital knew who I was now. She knocked on his door and whispered something I couldn't hear. A moment later, she gestured for me to enter. Dr. Blackwood rose from behind his mahogany desk. He was a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. We had worked together for years when I was chief of pediatric surgery. He extended his hand and I shook it firmly despite the pain movement caused. He gestured to a leather chair across from his desk. I sat carefully, trying not to wheeze. The incision pulled with every movement. He settled back into his chair and steepled his fingers, studying me over his glasses. I pulled out my phone and showed him photos I had taken in recovery. My medical chart, the falsified temperature reading, the documented hysteria diagnosis Brenda had written before my appendix ruptured. His jaw tightened as he scrolled through the evidence. He set the phone down and rubbed his temples. I could see the calculations running through his mind, the liability, the publicity, the damage to the hospital's reputation. He opened his mouth to speak, but I held up my hand. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were printed emails from other staff members who had witnessed the incident. 3 nurses, 2 orderlies, even a patient who had been in the waiting room. They all described what they saw, how Brenda had humiliated me, how she had denied basic medical care, how she had ordered security to remove me while I was clearly in medical distress. Dr. Blackwood read each statement slowly. His face grew more grave with each page. When he finished, he set the folder down and looked at me directly. I met his gaze without flinching. He picked up his phone and made a call. I heard him request Brenda's personnel file. Within minutes, his secretary brought in a thick manila folder. He opened it and began reading. I watched his expression change from concern to alarm. He turned the folder toward me. There were 3 previous complaints, all from patients who wore hijabs or other religious coverings, all dismissed as misunderstandings or cultural differences, all signed off by the same nursing supervisor. I felt my stomach turn and knot from the surgery. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern, and the hospital had enabled it by looking the other way. Dr. Blackwood closed the folder and stood. He walked to the window and stared out at the parking lot below. I waited in silence. The clock on his wall ticked loudly in the quiet office. Finally, he turned back to me. He said Brenda would be placed on administrative leave immediately pending a full investigation. I shook my head. That wasn't enough. Not after what she had done. Not after what she had been allowed to do to others. I stood despite the pain it caused. I told him I wanted to be part of the investigation. I wanted access to all the previous complaints. I wanted to interview the other patients who had been mistreated. I wanted transparency in the process. He started to object, but I cut him off. I reminded him that I had given 5 years of my life to this hospital. I had brought prestige and recognition through my surgical work. I had trained dozens of residents who now worked in hospitals across the country, and in my moment of greatest need, his staff had nearly unalived me because of the color of my skin and the covering on my head. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital at 7 sharp. Brenda's shift started at 8. I positioned myself in the lobby where I could see the employee entrance. My surgical sight HD from standing, but I ignored it. She walked in at 7:45, coffee in hand, chatting with another nurse. She laughed at something her colleague said. Then she saw me. The coffee cup slipped from her hand and crashed to the floor. Brown liquid splashed across the white tiles. I didn't move. I just watched as she stood frozen, coffee pooling around her white sneakers. Her colleague looked between us, confused. Brenda's face had gone pale. The way Brenda suddenly freezes when she spots a mirror makes me wonder what's really going through her mind right now. Is it fear of losing her job or actual recognition of what she did? She knew why I was there. Security approached her, not aggressively but with purpose. They handed her a letter. She didn't need to open it to know what it said. Administrative leave effective immediately. Pending investigation. She looked at me one more time before they escorted her to collect her belongings. Over the next week, I threw myself into the investigation despite my doctor's orders to rest. I interviewed the 3 previous complainants. Each story was heartbreakingly similar. Delayed care, humiliation, dismissive treatment. One woman had suffered a miscarriage while waiting 6 hours to be seen. Another had a severe allergic reaction that nearly unalived her because Brenda refused to believe she wasn't being dramatic. I compiled everything into a comprehensive report. Not just the incidents, but the systemic failures that allowed them to happen, the supervisor who dismissed complaints, the lack of cultural sensitivity training, the absence of accountability measures. But Brenda wasn't going down without a fight. She hired a lawyer and filed a grievance with the nursing union. She claimed she was being scapegoated for following hospital protocols. She said I was using my influence to destroy her career out of personal vengeance. Then things got worse. I started receiving anonymous notes in my hospital mailbox, warnings to back off, threats about what would happen if I continued pursuing the investigation. One morning, I found my car tires slashed in the hospital parking garage. I reported each incident to security, but they found nothing on the cameras. The angles were conveniently obscured, the timestamps mysteriously corrupted. Someone was protecting Brenda, and they were good at it. Dr. Blackwood called me into his office again. This time, he wasn't alone. The hospital's legal counsel sat beside him, a woman in a severe black suit who introduced herself as Victoria Jones. She got straight to the point. The hospital wanted to settle quietly, a generous sum in exchange for my silence and dropping the investigation. I looked at the number she wrote on a piece of paper. It was substantial, more than enough to cover my medical bills and lost wages, enough to make this all go away. All I had to do was sign a non-disclosure agreement and pretend none of this ever happened. I tore the paper in half. The investigation continued, but now I faced resistance at every turn. Witnesses suddenly became reluctant to talk. Documents went missing from files. The nursing supervisor, who had dismissed the previous complaints, took early retirement before I could interview her. Brenda returned to work after her union filed an injunction. She was assigned to a different department, but I saw her in the hallways. She would smirk when we passed. She knew she was winning. One afternoon, I was reviewing patient files in the medical library. When Dr. Theo Martinks approached me, he was a young resident who had been in the ER during my incident. He glanced around nervously before sitting across from me. He slid a USB drive across the table. He told me it contained security footage from that night, the real footage, not the edited version. The hospital claimed was all they had. He had saved it before someone could delete it. I plugged the drive into my laptop. There it was. Crystal clear video of Brenda pulling off my hijab, of her pressing on my abdomen while I screamed, of her ordering security to throw me out while I was clearly in medical distress, of her laughing with colleagues afterward about teaching me a lesson. But there was more. audio recordings of Brenda making prejudiced comments about Middle Eastern patients, emails where she bragged about making those people wait longer, a whole pattern of discrimination documented in digital evidence. Dr. Martinix told me Brenda had friends in it who usually scrubbed this stuff, but he had gotten to it first. He was tired of watching her get away with it. He had seen too many patients suffer. I copied everything onto multiple drives. One for Dr. Blackwood, one for the hospital board, one for my lawyer because now I needed one. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every patient Brenda had hurt and would continue to hurt if she wasn't stopped. The next board meeting was in 3 days. I prepared my presentation meticulously, every piece of evidence organized, every testimony documented, every failure of the system laid bare. Brenda might have friends in the hospital, but I had something more powerful: the truth. The morning of the board meeting, I arrived early. The boardroom was on the top floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I set up my laptop and tested the projection system. Everything had to be perfect, but when I tried to access my files, they were corrupted, all of them. The USB drives I had brought were blank. Someone had gotten to them. I felt panic rise in my throat, but pushed it down. I still had the originals on my laptop at home. I called Dr. Martinix, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I tried his pager. No response. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. I rushed to the residence lounge, but his colleague said he had been transferred suddenly to a hospital across the state. Effective immediately. No forwarding information. I stood in the empty boardroom, my hands trembling as I stared at the blank screen. The board members would arrive in 20 minutes. Without evidence, I had nothing but my word against Brenda's. My phone buzzed, an unknown number. I answered and heard heavy breathing. Then a whisper warned me to leave the hospital immediately if I knew what was good for me. The line went dead. I sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs. My surgical incision throbbed with each heartbeat. Through the window, I watched the morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Somewhere in this building, Brenda was probably preparing her own defense. The boardroom door opened. Dr. Blackwood entered, followed by 5 board members. They took their seats around the polished table. The board chair, a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes, looked at me expectantly. I explained about the corrupted files, about Dr. Martinix's sudden transfer, about the threats. Several board members exchanged glances. One checked his watch. Another tapped her pen impatiently against the table. Dr. Blackwood cleared his throat and suggested we reschedule. The board chair agreed. They had other matters to discuss. I was dismissed with polite but firm efficiency. I walked out of the boardroom feeling defeated. In the hallway, I nearly collided with Brenda. She wore fresh scrubs and a satisfied smile. She brushed past me without a word, but her shoulder check was deliberate. The impact sent pain shooting through my incision. Back in my car, I called my home computer remotely. The files were gone there, too. Everything wiped clean. Even my cloud backups had been deleted. Whoever was helping Brenda had technical skills and access I hadn't anticipated. I drove home in a daze. My apartment felt different somehow. Nothing was obviously out of place, but small things were wrong. A drawer slightly open, papers on my desk rearranged. Someone had been here. My neighbor, Mrs. Jones, knocked on my door. She mentioned seeing maintenance workers earlier, though she didn't remember calling for any repairs. Her description matched no one from our building's regular staff. I spent the rest of the day trying to reconstruct my evidence. I called the 3 women who had filed previous complaints. The first 2 numbers were disconnected. The third woman answered, but immediately hung up when I identified myself. When I called back, the number was blocked. That evening, I received an email from HR. My hospital privileges were suspended pending review. The email cited concerns about my mental state following my recent medical emergency. It recommended I take extended leave to focus on my recovery. I drove back to the hospital despite the suspension. I needed to find allies, someone who could help me fight back. The security guard at the entrance looked uncomfortable when he saw me. He made a phone call, then apologetically informed me I wasn't allowed on the premises. Standing in the parking lot, I watched the building where I'd spent 5 years saving lives, where I'd performed surgeries that made medical history, where I was now treated like a security threat. My phone rang. Dr. Sarah Kim, a colleague from pediatric surgery. She spoke in hushed tones, asking to meet at a coffee shop downtown. She had information but couldn't talk at the hospital. I arrived at the coffee shop first. Dr. Kim entered 10 minutes later, glancing over her shoulder. She slid into the booth across from me and leaned forward conspiratorially. She explained that Brenda had connections throughout the hospital. Her cousin worked in IT. Her best friend was in HR. Her boyfriend was a security supervisor. They formed a protective network that had operated for years. Dr. Kim pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots she'd taken, emails between Brenda and her network, messages about targeting specific patients, jokes about teaching lessons to people they deemed problematic. She transferred the files to my phone. Finally, new evidence, but Dr. Kim warned me to be careful. Others who had tried to expose Brenda had faced consequences: mysterious performance reviews, sudden schedule changes, careers derailed through bureaucratic warfare. I thanked Dr. Kim and promised to protect her identity. She left quickly, and I noticed she took Auditus route back to her car. The paranoia was contagious. At home, I immediately backed up the files to multiple locations: physical drives hidden around my apartment, cloud services under fake names, emails to myself at addresses Brenda's network wouldn't know about. The next morning, I woke to find my car windshield smashed, glass scattered across the driver's seat. Brenda's got a whole tech support team running her mean girl operation. Talk about workplace networking gone wrong. Who needs LinkedIn when you've got family and it deleting evidence faster than your browser history after mom visits? A note tucked under the wiper blade read simply, "Final warning." I called the police. They took a report but seemed skeptical. No witnesses, no cameras covering that section of the parking lot without evidence. It was just vandalism. They'd file the report and that would be that. I spent the morning getting my windshield replaced. The repair shop was busy and I sat in their waiting room reviewing the files Dr. Kim had given me. The more I read, the angrier I became. Brenda's network had been systematically targeting patients for years. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number with a photo attachment. I opened it and my blood ran cold. It was a picture of my sister's house. She lived 3 states away with her 2 young children. The message below read, "Nice family. Be a shame if they needed emergency medical care." I called my sister immediately. She was fine. Confused by my panicked questions, I told her to be extra careful and to call me if anything seemed unusual. I couldn't explain the full situation without terrifying her. The threats were escalating. Brenda's network was showing me how far their reach extended. They wanted me to understand that this wasn't just about my career. They could hurt people I loved. I sat in my car outside the repair shop, weighing my options. I could give up, sign whatever they wanted, pretend none of this happened, or I could fight and risk everything. My phone rang. Dr. Blackwood's personal number. He asked me to meet him at his home that evening. He said he'd been doing his own investigation and had discovered disturbing things. I arrived at his house as the sun was setting. He lived in an older neighborhood with mature trees and well-maintained lawns. He answered the door himself and quickly ushered me inside. His living room was filled with boxes of files, personnel records, incident reports, financial documents. He'd spent days pulling everything he could find about Brenda and her network. He showed me what he'd discovered. Brenda's cousin in it had been manipulating patient wait times in the computer system, making it look like certain patients had arrived later than they actually had, creating false documentation to support Brenda's version of events. The HR friend had been burying complaints, not just dismissing them, but actually destroying the original documents and creating sanitized versions that removed key details. 3 years of systematic cover-ups. The security boyfriend had been editing footage, not just deleting it, but using software to create false timestamps and altered sequences, making it appear that incidents happened differently than they actually had. Dr. Blackwood had also found financial irregularities. Brenda's network had been manipulating overtime records, claiming hours they hadn't worked, approving each other's false timesheets, stealing thousands from the hospital. He had everything documented, real evidence that couldn't be destroyed by deleting some files, physical papers, original documents, financial records that existed in multiple systems, but he also warned me that taking this to the board would be dangerous. Brenda's network had survived this long because they were willing to destroy anyone who threatened them. He'd already received his own warnings. We spent hours organizing the evidence, creating multiple copies, preparing a presentation that would be undeniable. By midnight, we had a comprehensive case that exposed not just Brenda's discrimination, but the entire network's corruption. I left his house with a box of copied documents. As I loaded them into my car, I noticed a vehicle parked down the street. Its engine was running, but its lights were off. When I started driving, it followed. I took several random turns. The car stayed with me. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I tried to remember the route to the nearest police station, but before I could get there, the car accelerated and rammed my bumper. The impact sent me spinning. My car jumped the curb and struck a mailbox. The airbag deployed, stunning me momentarily. When my vision cleared, the other car was gone. A homeowner came out and called 911. The police arrived, followed by an ambulance. I declined medical treatment but gave a statement about being followed and rammed. Without a license plate or clear description of the vehicle, there wasn't much they could do. My car was towed. I took an Uber home, clutching the box of documents. My apartment door was ajar when I arrived. I could see from the hallway that the place had been ransacked. I called 911 again. While waiting for police, I checked the box. The documents were all there. They'd been looking for something specific and hadn't found it because I'd had it with me. The police took another report. 2 incidents in one night was suspicious, they admitted, but without evidence connecting them or identifying suspects, their hands were tied. They suggested I stay somewhere else for a few nights. I packed a bag and went to a hotel. At the front desk, I paid cash and used a fake name. In my room, I deadbolted the door and pushed a chair against it. Then I sat on the bed surrounded by evidence and tried to figure out my next move. My phone had been buzzing with messages. Dr. Blackwood wanted to know if I was safe. Dr. Kim had heard about my suspension and was worried. My sister was freaking out because I'd called her in a panic, then gone silent. I texted everyone that I was fine. Then I turned off my phone and removed the battery. If they were tracking me, I needed to disappear for a while. The next morning, I woke to someone pounding on my door. Hotel security. There had been a complaint about suspicious activity in my room. They needed to investigate immediately. I knew this was wrong. Hotel security doesn't operate like this. I grabbed the documents in my bag, then climbed out the bathroom window. It was only a 1-story drop to the parking lot. I landed hard, my surgical incision screaming in protest, but I kept moving. I needed a new plan, somewhere safe to regroup, someone Brenda's network couldn't reach. I remember Dr. Martinez, an old colleague who'd retired last year. He lived an hour outside the city on a small farm. He'd always said if I needed anything to call, I hoped he meant it. I rented a car using my credit card, knowing it would leave a trail, but having no choice. During the drive, I kept checking the mirrors for anyone following. The rural roads were mostly empty. Dr. Martinez was surprised to see me, but immediately invited me in. His wife made coffee while I explained everything. They listened with growing alarm as I described Brenda's network and their escalating threats. He offered me their guest room for as long as I needed. His farm was isolated enough that unexpected visitors would be noticed. He also had security cameras, a habit from years of storing expensive medical equipment in his barn. I spent the next 2 days organizing the evidence into an airtight case. Dr. Martinez helped using his decades of hospital experience to identify the most damning violations. His wife, a former nurse, provided insights into how Brenda's network had manipulated hospital protocols. On the 3rd day, Dr. Blackwood called Dr. Martinez's landline. He'd been trying to reach me. The board had scheduled an emergency meeting. Brenda's network had overplayed their hand. The financial irregularities had triggered an automatic audit. The hospital's accounting system had flagged unusual patterns in overtime payments. An external auditor was coming in, and Brenda's network couldn't manipulate outside investigators. This was our chance. Doctor? Blackwood wanted me at the meeting to present our evidence while the auditors were there. Outside witnesses would make it harder for Brenda's network to bury the truth. I drove back to the city the night before the meeting. Instead of going home, I checked into a different hotel near the hospital. I spent the evening making final preparations, organizing documents, and practicing my presentation. The morning of the meeting, I arrived at the hospital early. The parking lot was fuller than usual. I recognized several board members' cars, but also vehicles I didn't know. The external auditors, presumably security, tried to stop me at the entrance, citing my suspension, but Dr. Blackwood appeared and overrode them. He had authority to bring in consultants for the investigation. I was officially his consultant for the day. We walked through the hospital together. Staff members stared as we passed. Word had spread about the emergency meeting. Everyone knew something big was happening. Outside the boardroom, Brenda stood with her cousin and her HR friend. They were huddled together, whispering urgently. When they saw me, Brenda's face contorted with rage. Her cousin put a restraining hand on her arm. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. The 5 board members sat on one side of the table. 3 external auditors occupied the other side. Dr. Blackwood and I took seats at the end. The board chair called the meeting to order. She explained that serious allegations had been raised about hospital operations. Financial irregularities had been discovered. An investigation was needed to determine the full scope of the problems. The lead auditor presented their preliminary findings. Over time, fraud totaling over $40,000, systematic manipulation of computer records, evidence of destroyed documents. The board members looked increasingly grim as the list grew. Then it was my turn. I opened my box of documents and began distributing copies, incident reports, witness statements, screenshots of messages between Brenda's network, evidence of patient discrimination spanning 3 years. I presented each piece methodically. The falsified medical records from my own ER visit, the testimonies from other women who'd been mistreated, the pattern of targeting patients based on religion and ethnicity, Brenda standing outside that boardroom with her crew while I walk past. I'm really curious what they're whispering about so urgently right now. The cousin's hand on Brenda's arm suggests they know something's different about this meeting, something they can't control like they usually do with their inside connections. The board members passed documents between themselves. One auditor was taking extensive notes. Another was photographing key evidence. The room was silent except for the rustling of papers. When I finished, the board chair asked if Brenda would like to respond. The door opened and Brenda entered with her lawyer. She denied everything, claimed the evidence was fabricated, accused me of conducting a vendetta because of my medical emergency, but her story began to unravel when the auditors asked specific questions. She couldn't explain the overtime discrepancies. Her cousin had no justification for the altered computer records. The HR friend couldn't account for the missing complaint files. The board chair called for a recess. Brenda and her group huddled with their lawyer in the hallway. I could see them arguing through the glass doors. The cousin was gesturing angrily. The HR friend was crying. When we reconvened, Brenda's lawyer announced they were invoking their union rights and would not answer further questions without proper representation, but the damage was done. The evidence spoke for itself. The board voted unanimously to expand the investigation. The external auditors would conduct a full review. All involved parties would be suspended immediately pending the outcome. Law enforcement would be notified about the financial fraud. Brenda's face went white as the board chair read the decision. Her network of protection was crumbling. The cousin from IT, the friend in HR, the boyfriend in security, all suspended, all facing potential criminal charges. As the meeting ended, Brenda confronted me in the hallway. Her lawyer tried to restrain her, but she shook him off. She stood inches from my face, her eyes blazing with hatred. She hissed that this wasn't over, that I'd regret destroying her life, that she knew where I lived, where my family lived. Her lawyer physically dragged her away as she continued making threats. Dr. Blackwood walked me to my car. He assured me that hospital security would monitor Brenda and her associates. The police had been notified about the threats. He would personally ensure my safety on hospital property, but I knew Brenda was right about one thing. This wasn't over. Her network might be dismantled, but she still had allies. People who believed her version of events. People who thought I was the villain in this story. Over the following days, I received dozens of messages, some supportive thanking me for exposing the corruption, others hostile, accusing me of ruining innocent people's careers. The hospital staff was divided. Dr. Kim called to congratulate me on my courage. She said other victims were coming forward now that Brenda's network couldn't retaliate. The investigation was expanding as more evidence surfaced, but there were also setbacks. Brenda's union filed a formal grievance. They claimed the investigation was biased, that proper procedures hadn't been followed. They demanded reinstatement for all suspended employees. The local news picked up the story. Hospital discrimination scandal made headlines. Reporters called asking for interviews. Brenda's lawyer went on TV claiming his client was a scapegoat for systemic hospital failures. I stayed quiet on legal advice, let the investigation speak for itself. But it was hard watching Brenda play victim in the media, harder still when protesters appeared outside the hospital supporting her. My sister called, worried about the news coverage. I assured her everything was fine, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. The story was getting twisted, facts were being distorted. Brenda was winning the public relations war. Then came another blow. The boyfriend in security was reinstated. His union successfully argued that he couldn't be held responsible for following orders from supervisors. He was back at work watching the cameras, controlling access to the building. I no longer felt safe at the hospital. Every time I visited for follow-up appointments about my surgery, I felt eyes on me. Security guards who whispered when I passed, nurses who turned away when I approached. Dr. Blackwood tried to reassure me. The investigation was progressing. More evidence was being uncovered. Financial forensics had found additional fraud. Patient complaints going back 5 years were being reviewed, but Brenda remained free, pending the investigation's conclusion. Her lawyer had negotiated house arrest instead of jail for the financial charges. She was using the time to coordinate her defense and rally supporters. Late one evening, my apartment building's fire alarm went off. Everyone evacuated to the parking lot. When we were finally allowed back in, my door was open. Nothing was stolen, but someone had been inside. A message was clear. They could reach me whenever they wanted. I moved to a different apartment complex across town. The building had better security and multiple exits. My sister helped me pack, though I kept the real reasons vague. She thought I was just stressed from work drama. The investigation dragged on for weeks. Brenda's lawyer filed motion after motion, challenging every piece of evidence. The hospital board grew impatient with the delays. Some members started questioning whether pursuing this was worth the negative publicity. Dr. Blackwood kept me updated through encrypted messages. The auditors had uncovered more financial fraud than initially suspected. Brenda's network had stolen over $70,000 through various schemes, but proving individual culpability was proving difficult. I returned to work at a different hospital. The commute was longer, but I needed the income and routine. My new colleagues were professional but distant. Word travels fast in medical circles. Everyone knew about the scandal at my former workplace. Brenda's cousin and it cut a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for testimony, he'd received reduced charges. His cooperation revealed the full extent of their data manipulation. Years of altered records, deleted complaints, fabricated documentation to protect each other. The HR friend wasn't as cooperative. She maintained her innocence despite mounting evidence. Her lawyer argued she was just following established procedures. The missing complaint files were unfortunate oversights, not deliberate destruction. I attended depositions when required. Brenda sat across the conference table, her lawyer whispering constant instructions. She answered questions with practiced evasion, every response carefully crafted to admit nothing while casting doubt on my motivations. During one session, new evidence emerged. The security boyfriend had kept backup files of the original footage, not to preserve evidence, but to blackmail colleagues who'd been caught in compromising situations. His greed ultimately exposed Brenda's crimes. The footage was damning. Multiple incidents of Brenda mistreating patients, clear discrimination based on appearance and religion. Her lawyer requested a recess. When they returned, Brenda's demeanor had changed. The confidence was gone. More victims came forward. An elderly Sikh man who'd been denied pain medication, a young woman in a niqab who'd been turned away despite severe symptoms. Each story added weight to the pattern of discrimination. The hospital's insurance company got involved. They saw massive liability exposure. Their lawyers pushed for quick resolution, settle with victims, terminate problem employees, implement new policies, minimize financial damage. Brenda's union continued fighting. They organized protests outside the hospital. Supporters held signs claiming she was a dedicated nurse being railroaded. The media coverage intensified. Opinion pieces debated healthcare discrimination versus employee rights. I received a settlement offer from the hospital. Substantial compensation for my suffering. All medical bills covered. A formal apology. In exchange, I'd sign a non-disclosure agreement. The hospital wanted this story to disappear. I consulted with my lawyer. She advised taking the deal. The money would provide security. The apology would be public vindication. Fighting further risked losing everything if Brenda's union prevailed in arbitration. But other victims deserve justice, too. I negotiated different terms. The hospital would establish a fund for all affected patients. Mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff and independent ombudsmen to investigate future complaints. Public acknowledgement of systemic failures. The hospital board reluctantly agreed. They announced the changes at a press conference. No admission of legal wrongdoing, but acknowledgement that patients had received substandard care. New policies would ensure it never happened again. Brenda's criminal trial began 3 months later. Financial fraud charges. Federal prosecutors had built a strong case. The evidence was overwhelming. Falsified timesheets, forged signatures, electronic trails showing coordinated theft. I testified about discovering the fraud during my investigation. The prosecutor presented my documentation. Brenda's lawyer tried to discredit me, suggesting I'd fabricated evidence out of revenge, but the financial records spoke for themselves. The cousin testified against Brenda as part of his plea deal. He detailed their schemes, how they divided stolen overtime payments, how Brenda had initiated the fraud and recruited others. His testimony was devastating to her defense. Other hospital employees testified about the culture of fear Brenda had created. Nurses who'd been threatened for questioning her actions, doctors who'd been undermined when they advocated for certain patients, a toxic environment that enabled discrimination. Brenda took the stand in her own defense. She portrayed herself as a dedicated nurse overwhelmed by difficult patients. She claimed cultural misunderstandings, not deliberate discrimination. Brenda's lawyer yanking her away while she's making threats is like watching someone try to stop their friend from posting that regret-filled text at 2 a.m., except with more legal consequences and less autocorrect. She denied any intentional wrongdoing. Under cross-examination, her story crumbled. The prosecutor presented her own emails mocking patients, text messages coordinating with her network, financial records showing unexplained deposits. Her denials rang hollow against documented evidence. The jury deliberated for 2 days, guilty on all counts of fraud, guilty of conspiracy. The discrimination charges weren't part of the criminal case, but the guilty verdict validated everything I'd exposed. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. Brenda received 3 years in federal prison. Her cousin got 18 months. The HR friend received 2 years probation and community service. The security boyfriend pleaded to lesser charges and got probation. The hospital faced civil lawsuits from multiple patients. Most settled out of court. The total cost ran into millions. Several board members resigned. Dr. Blackwood was promoted to CEO with a mandate to reform the institution's culture. I returned to the hospital for a final meeting. Dr. Blackwood wanted to offer me a position. Not just returning to surgery, but overseeing diversity and inclusion initiatives, help ensure what happened to me never happened to another patient. I considered the offer carefully. Returning to where I'd been humiliated held no appeal, but the opportunity to create real change was tempting, to transform the institution from within, to be part of the solution. Brenda's supporters gradually disappeared. Without her network protecting them, other problematic employees were exposed. Some resigned quietly, others were terminated for cause. The culture slowly began shifting. I accepted the position with conditions: direct reporting to the CEO, authority to investigate complaints, budget for comprehensive training programs. The board approved everything. They needed someone with credibility to lead reform. My first day back was surreal. The same hallways where I'd been dismissed now welcomed me. Staff members who'd looked away now sought my guidance. The power dynamics had completely reversed. I implemented anonymous reporting systems. Patients could file complaints without fear. Staff could report discrimination without retaliation. Every complaint was investigated thoroughly. Patterns were identified and addressed systematically. The training programs were mandatory for everyone. From janitors to surgeons, everyone attended sessions on cultural sensitivity. We brought in experts. Patients from diverse backgrounds shared their experiences. Slowly, understanding grew. Some staff resisted the changes. They complained about political correctness. They resented the new oversight. A few requested transfers to other hospitals. I considered their departures a positive development. Brenda's former allies faced their own consequences. The IT cousin struggled to find work after prison. His reputation in healthcare IT was destroyed. The HR friend lost her certification. She eventually left healthcare entirely. I established a patient advocacy program. Volunteers from various communities helped navigate cultural differences. They served as liaison between patients and staff. Misunderstandings decreased. Patient satisfaction scores improved significantly. The media attention eventually faded. New scandals replaced ours in the headlines. But the changes we implemented endured. Other hospitals began adopting similar programs. What started as personal injustice sparked broader reform. Brenda was released after serving 2 years. Good behavior and overcrowding led to early release. She was barred from working in healthcare. Last I heard, she was working retail in another state. I sometimes wondered if she felt remorse, if prison had changed her perspectives, if she understood the harm she'd caused. But I realized it didn't matter. The system that enabled her was being dismantled. My surgical skills hadn't diminished during the administrative work. I returned to the O part-time, balancing surgery with reform work, using my position to ensure every patient received equal care. The hospital's reputation recovered slowly. Patient diversity increased. Staff diversity improved. What had been an institution marked by discrimination became a model for inclusive healthcare. The transformation took years, but it was real. I never forgot that night in the ER. The pain, the humiliation, the near-death experience. But I transformed that trauma into purpose. Every policy change, every training session, every patient protected, all stemming from that terrible night. My family remained supportive throughout. My sister became an advocate in her own community. She shared our story, educated others about healthcare discrimination, turned our experience into awareness. The financial settlement provided security, but the real victory was systemic change, knowing future patients wouldn't suffer as I had, that Brenda's network couldn't reform elsewhere, that accountability finally existed. Looking back, I sometimes wished things had been different, that I'd received care without discrimination, that my appendix hadn't nearly unalived me. But without that experience, how many others would have continued suffering in silence? The scars from my emergency surgery faded. The emotional scars took longer to heal. But I found purpose in the pain, direction in the discrimination, strength and survival. My story became part of hospital orientation. New employees learned what happened, why our policies existed, how discrimination nearly unalived a patient, the importance of treating everyone with equal dignity. Years later, I still work at the hospital, still fighting for equity, still ensuring no patient faces what I endured. The work is ongoing, progress is incremental, but every small victory matters. Every patient protected validates the struggle. The hospital where I nearly died became the place where I found my calling, not just as a surgeon saving lives in the O, but as an advocate ensuring everyone who walks through those doors receives the care they deserve. The transformation was complete. Thanks for letting me throw all those questions into the mix. It's been surprisingly fun wondering about it all with you. See you around. Like the video. It helps more than you think.